You need to be strong for them.
I can't. Not without you.
Daddy?
The first face Mateo Herrera saw when he opened his eyes after 5 years was a little girl he had never met, and she was crying, and she was calling him Daddy. He did not know her. He did not know the boy standing behind her, gripping the metal rail of the hospital bed with both hands like it was the only solid thing in the world. He did not know the third one, the smallest, a girl no older than 4, who was asleep in the arms of a black woman he half recognized from somewhere very far away. A woman whose face was wet and shining, and looking at him like he was a miracle and a catastrophe at the same time. 3 children, 3 brown and golden faces he had never seen in his life, and every one of them, the nurses would tell him later, had been coming to this room for 5 years to talk to a man who could not hear them. Mateo, the woman whispered. She had his wife's voice. She was his wife. Camille. The name arrived a full second after the face, like an echo catching up to a shout. Mateo, it's me. It's okay. You're okay. He tried to speak, and his voice came out as a rasp, a sound like a door that had not been opened in a long time. And the question he managed to force through his cracked lips was not, "Where am I?" And it was not, "What happened to me?" It was 4 words, and they broke the woman's heart in half, and she would remember them for the rest of her life. Whose kids are these? The room went silent. The little girl stopped crying. Camille's face did something complicated. Grief and terror and a strange, fierce love, all fighting for the same square inch of skin. And she opened her mouth to answer, and no sound came out. Because the honest answer, the true answer, the answer that a court of law and an entire whispering town would spend the next months trying to tear apart, was the one thing this man with the empty eyes was not ready to hear. They were his, all 3 of them, legally, completely, by his own signature and his own free choice. These 3 children he did not recognize were his son and his daughters. And the man lying in that bed had no memory of ever agreeing to it, no memory of the night that put him here, and no idea that the moment he was strong enough to stand, powerful people were going to try to prove he was too broken to keep them. How does a man wake up a father to children he's never met? And why would anyone fight so hard to take them away? You have to go back 5 years and 1 week to a fire, a promise made in a hospital corridor, and a signature on a legal document that a good man wrote with a steady hand before the world went dark. Wherever you're watching this from, tell me in the comments. And if you've ever loved a child that no one thought you had the right to love, stay with me. This whole story is for you. To understand the man in that bed, you have to understand that Mateo Herrera had spent his whole life being the person other people leaned on, and almost none of his life being leaned on in return, and he had never once complained about the arrangement. He was 45 years old the year he woke up. He taught woodworking and metal shop at Lincoln High, the kind of class that districts are always trying to cut, and that saves a certain kind of kid every single year, the kid who is failing everything else, and finds out in Mr. Herrera's shop that his hands are smart even when the tests say his head is not. Mateo had been that kid once. He remembered exactly how it felt to be written off. He had built his entire adult life around making sure the kids in his room never felt it. There was a boy named Devon in Mateo's 3rd period class the year before the crash, a 15-year-old who had already been suspended twice, and who everyone at Lincoln High had quietly decided was a lost cause. Devon came into the shop angry at the world and slammed his tools, and dared anyone to correct him. Mateo did not correct him. He handed him a broken chair and said, without any speech attached to it, "This belonged to my grandmother. See if you can save it." And Devon, who had never once been trusted with anything, spent 3 weeks on that chair. And when he finished it, He could not stop looking at it, because he had made a thing that would outlast him, and no one had ever shown him that his hands could do that. Devon graduated. Devon runs a cabinet shop now with 4 employees. He came to visit Mateo in the Coma twice a year for 5 years, and sat there and told a sleeping man about the business, because Mateo Herrera had a way of leaving fingerprints on people that stayed long after he was gone from a room. That was the man. Remember him, because the world was about to decide he was worthless. He was not a rich man. He and Camille lived in a small blue house on Delacroix Street, with a porch he had rebuilt himself, and a workshop in the garage that smelled of sawdust and machine oil, and was, to anyone who knew him, the truest room in the house. Camille was a pediatric nurse. They had met at a mutual friend's barbecue 11 years before the Coma, and she had liked immediately that he listened more than he talked, and he had liked that when she laughed, she did it with her whole body and did not care who was watching. They wanted children. They had tried for years. It had not happened for them the way it happens for other people, and they had made a quiet peace with that, the kind of peace that has a bruise underneath it that never fully fades. And then there was Marcus. Marcus Bell had been Mateo's best friend since they were 9 years old, since a schoolyard in a rough part of the city where a small Latino kid and a smaller black kid had been jumped by the same older boys on the same afternoon, and had, in the strange arithmetic of childhood, decided to be brothers about it. That friendship lasted 36 years. Marcus was the loud one, the funny one, the one who filled a room. Mateo was the quiet foundation the room stood on. Marcus married a woman named Denise, a schoolteacher with a laugh even bigger than his own, and they had 3 children, and they asked Mateo and Camille to be godparents, and the 2 families braided themselves together so tightly that the children grew up calling Mateo Tio and Camille Auntie Cam, and did not think of them as anything less than blood. The oldest was Jalen, a serious boy who loved to take apart radios, and who spent every Saturday he could in Mateo's workshop, the 2 of them barely talking, just building. The middle child was Aisha, all elbows and opinions, and a memory like a steel trap. And the baby was Nia, born the year everything changed, a round-cheeked infant who fell asleep on Mateo's chest the first time he held her, and, in some quiet way he could never have explained, rearranged something inside him. Mateo had made his peace with never being a father. Then these 3 children walked into his life through the side door, and he became one anyway, in every way that mattered except the paperwork. Then, on a cold night in March, 6 years before Mateo would open his eyes in that hospital, the paperwork became the only thing that mattered in the world. There was a fire. An electrical fault in the walls of an old rental house, the kind of thing that inspectors are supposed to catch and slumlords are supposed to fix, and that kills people in this country every single week without making the news. Marcus got all 3 children out. He went back in for Denise. Neither of them came out again. And in one night, in the time it takes a cheap wire to spark behind a wall, 3 children became orphans, and Mateo Herrera lost the brother he had chosen at 9 years old. The nights that followed were the worst of Mateo's life, and they were also the nights that revealed exactly who he was. There was never a question, not for 1 second, not for 1 heartbeat, about what would happen to Jaylen and Aisha and Nia. Marcus and Denise had a will. They had named their godparents as guardians years earlier, at a kitchen table, half joking the way young parents do about a thing they never believe will actually happen. Mateo and Camille took the 3 grieving children into the small blue house on Delacroix Street, and they did not treat it as a burden, and they did not treat it as charity. They treated it as the most natural thing in the world, because to Mateo it was. He had promised his brother, in a hospital corridor years before when Denise was pregnant with Nia and scared, that if anything ever happened he would show up. And Mateo Herrera was, above every other thing he was, a man who showed up. But there was a complication, and the complication had a name, and the name was Terence Bell. Terence was Marcus's older brother, and the two of them had not spoken in 9 years. Where Marcus had been warmth, Terence was appetite. He had left the old neighborhood young and come back rarely, and when he did come back it was in a leased luxury car with a story about a business that was always just about to take off, and he had a way of appearing exactly when there was money in a room, and vanishing exactly when there was grief. He had not come to the wedding. He had come to the funeral. And at the funeral, standing over the 2 closed caskets of his brother and his sister-in-law, Terence Bell had learned 2 things that changed the course of everything. He learned that there was a life insurance policy, a serious one, that Marcus had quietly paid into for years, so his children would never be without. And he learned that all of it, every dollar, along with the children themselves, was going to a Mexican shop teacher named Mateo Herrera. That was the beginning. That was the thing that lit the fuse, and it would smolder for 5 more years, waiting for the day Mateo could not defend himself. Because here is what Mateo did before he was hurt, and here is why it mattered so much later. In the months after the fire, quietly and without fanfare, Mateo and Camille did more than take the children in. They began the long, expensive, paperwork-heavy process of legally adopting all 3. It was not necessary for their care. The guardianship covered that. But Mateo wanted the children to have his name if they wanted it. He wanted there to be no room, ever, for any judge, or any stranger, or any Terence Bell to say, "These are not really your kids." He wanted it carved in stone. So he hired a lawyer he could barely afford, and he filled out every form, and he sat through every interview, and on a Tuesday afternoon in March, 5 years and 1 week before he would wake up confused in a hospital bed, Mateo Herrera signed the final adoption decree in a county office with a cheap county pen, making Jaylen, Aisha, and Nia Bell into Jaylen, Aisha, and Nia Herrera, his children, fully and forever, in the eyes of the only law that gets to decide such things. He drove home from that office happier than he had been since the fire. He called Camille from the car to tell her it was done, that it was official, that they were a family on paper now, the way they had been a family in truth for a year. She could hear him smiling through the phone. She told him to drive safe. She told him she loved him. It was the last conversation they would have for 5 years. A truck ran a red light at the corner of Delacroix and Fifth. The driver was texting. He never even braked. Mateo's small car was hit on the driver's side at 40 miles an hour. And the man who had spent that entire afternoon making sure 3 orphan children would always have a father was pulled from the wreckage with a traumatic brain injury and a heartbeat so faint the paramedics almost missed it. He did not wake up that night. He did not wake up that week. The doctors used the word coma, and then they used the harder words, the ones about how the longer it lasts, the less likely it becomes. And Camille Herrera stood in a hospital corridor, not far from where her husband had once promised his best friend that he would show up, and she made the same promise back to him. She would show up every day, however long it took. She kept it. For 5 years, she kept it. And this is the part of the story that the town would later pretend not to remember, when it was busy whispering. For 5 years, Camille Herrera raised 3 grieving, traumatized, growing children entirely alone, on a single nurse's salary, while spending every spare hour at the bedside of a husband who could not speak to her. She worked doubles. She learned to braid Aisha's hair from videos on her phone at midnight. She sat in parent-teacher conferences alone and coached Jaylen through the anger that a boy carries when he has lost too much too young, and she brought all 3 children to the hospital every single week, and she made them talk to their father because some doctor had told her once that hearing helps. and because she refused to let them forget the man who had chosen them. Little Nia did not remember him awake at all. To Nia, Daddy was a sleeping man in a bed, a warm hand she was allowed to hold, a story her mother told her every night about a carpenter who loved her so much he signed a paper to keep her forever. That was the father Nia knew, a sleeping legend, a promise in a hospital bed. There was one night in the 3rd year that Camille never told anyone about, because it frightened her too much to say out loud. Jalen, 12 by then, had gotten into a fight at school, a bad one, the kind that gets a boy sent home. When she picked him up, he would not speak in the car. And when they got home, he finally broke, and it came out of him in a flood, all the grief a boy buries so his sisters won't see it. He said he was tired of being the man of the house. He said he was tired of a father who just lay there. He said, and this was the part that split Camille open, that maybe it would be better if his dad just died already so they could stop driving to that room and pretending. Then he saw his mother's face and started to cry, because he did not mean it. He meant the opposite of it. He meant that he loved a sleeping man so much that the loving was killing him. Camille held her son on the kitchen floor for an hour that night. Then she drove all 3 children to the hospital at 10 p.m., against the rules, and she made them sit around their father's bed, and she told them the story again, the carpenter and the paper and the promise, and she made Jalen hold his father's hand, and she said, "He is fighting to come back to you, every day. The least we can do is not quit on him first." Jalen never talked about giving up again. He started bringing broken radios to the room instead, and setting them on the blanket, and telling his father he'd better wake up, because nobody else could fix them right. The town watched all of this. Some of it helped. Neighbors brought casseroles for a while, the way neighbors do, until the casseroles stopped the way they always stop. But underneath the sympathy, in the quiet way that towns talk, another story had started to grow. It was an ugly story, and it was a comfortable one, because it let people off the hook. The story went like this: 3 black children, a Latino man who wasn't really their father, a wife alone for 5 years, all that insurance money sitting in a trust. People did the cruel math that people do. They looked at Camille, alone and exhausted, and still young. And they looked at 3 children who did not share her husband's face, and they let themselves wonder out loud, in kitchens and at the grocery store, whether things were exactly what they see, whether that money was the real reason she kept that man alive on machines, whether those were even really his kids, or just a convenient story wrapped around a convenient fortune. None of them said it to her face. All of them said it behind her back. And the one man who would have stood up in the middle of the town square and ended every whisper with a single sentence was lying in a bed on the 3rd floor of Mercy General, dreaming whatever the deeply unconscious dream, unable to defend his wife, his children, or himself. And then, on an ordinary Thursday in the 5th year, with no warning and no reason the doctors could ever fully explain, Mateo Herrera's fingers moved. The waking was not like the movies. It was slow and terrible and confusing, a mind swimming up through 5 years of black water toward a light it did not understand. He did not know the year. He did not know his own age. Great pieces of his life were simply gone, wiped clean by the injury. And the cruelest gap of all was the last one. He had no memory of the adoption, no memory of the crash, no memory of the final year before the fire. In Mateo's mind, when he first swam up into the light, Marcus and Denise were still alive. The children were still just his godchildren's, small and occasional visitors. He had not signed any papers. He was not anyone's father. And so when he opened his eyes and found 3 children he did not recognize calling him daddy, and a wife weeping over him, his broken brain reached the only conclusion it could reach. and he asked the question that would echo through everything that came after. Whose kids are these? The doctors had a name for it. Retrograde amnesia, patchy and severe, common enough after an injury like his. They told Camille it might come back in pieces. They told her it might never come back at all. They told her, gently, that she needed to be prepared for the possibility that the man who woke up would not be exactly the man who went to sleep, and that he might never remember the children he had fought so hard to keep. Camille listened to all of it, and she nodded, and then she went into the hospital room, and she started, patiently, from the beginning. She showed him photographs. She told him about the fire. She watched his face crumple when he learned that Marcus was gone, watched him grieve a 5-year-old loss as if it were an hour old, because to him it was. And every day she brought the children, and every day she said the same thing to the confused, frightened man in the bed. They're ours, Matteo. You chose them. Even if you can't remember choosing them, you did, and I am going to help you remember. It might have been enough. Love and time and patience, in a fair world, might have been enough to put a family back together slowly, one memory at a time. But the world that Matteo woke into was not a fair one, and it had a lawyer in it, and the lawyer had already been waiting 5 years. Terence Bell had not forgotten the insurance money. He had spent 5 years telling himself a story in which he was the real family, the blood family, the one who had been robbed by a piece of paper and a foreigner. When the news reached him that Matteo had woken up, and woken up damaged, that he could not remember his own children, that he was confused and weak, and possibly not competent, Terence did not feel relief that his brother's friend had survived. He felt opportunity. He drove back into town in his leased car, and this time he brought a weapon. And the weapon's name was Preston Vance. Preston Vance was a family law attorney of a particular and expensive kind, the kind who advertises on billboards with the word fighter, and who understands that the family courts, for all their talk of the best interests of the child, can be moved by exactly the same ugly math the town had been whispering. Vance looked at the situation, and he saw the angles immediately. Here was a man, Matteo Herrera, who by his own admission could not remember adopting these children. Here was a man with a documented brain injury, unemployed, unable to work, possibly permanently impaired. Here were 3 children who did not biologically belong to him, sitting on top of a trust fund. And here was a blood relative, Terence Bell, ready and willing to take them in. Vance did not need to prove that Matteo was a bad man. He only needed to make a judge doubt, for one crucial moment, whether this confused and broken shop teacher was truly fit to raise 3 children, or whether the whole arrangement had been a mistake that a compassionate court could now correct. Before the petition, Terence came to the house. He had not set foot in the small blue house on Delacroix Street in 5 years, and he arrived on a Sunday in a car that cost more than Camille made in a year, and he sat in her living room among the children's school photos and the birdhouse Jalen and Matteo had built. And he was, at first, almost kind. He talked about family. He talked about how hard she must have had it, alone all this time, how no one could blame her if it had all become too much. He talked about Marcus, and his voice even caught, and for a moment Camille almost believed there was grief in him. Then he got to it. He said the children deserved to be with people who could give them things. He said a man who couldn't remember his own name was no father. He said there was money that should be helping his brother's children, real money, and it was a shame to see it wasted, keeping a vegetable on a feeding tube. He said all of this in Matteo's living room, 10 feet from where Matteo's daughters were doing homework. And Camille stood up and opened her front door and told Terence Bell to get out of her house. He smiled on his way out. He said, "Suit yourself. I tried to do this the nice way." 6 days later, the process server came. He filed the petition 6 weeks after Matteo woke up. Mateo was still learning to walk again, still doing hours of therapy a day just to reclaim his own body. When a process server handed his exhausted wife an envelope in the hospital parking lot, Terence Bell was petitioning for custody of Jalen, Aisha, and Nia, and the grounds, written in the cold, clean language of the law, landed on Camille like a physical blow. The children's adoptive father was mentally incompetent, the adoptive mother was overwhelmed and financially unstable, and the best interests of the children would be served by placement with their biological uncle. Attached was a motion to freeze the children's trust pending resolution, which meant that even the money Marcus had died to leave his kids could not be used to fight for them. Camille read the papers standing between two parked cars, and for the first time in 5 years, she felt something close to despair. She had survived the fire. She had survived the coma. She had survived 5 years of doing everything alone. And now, at the exact moment her husband had come back to her, a stranger in an expensive suit was going to try to take her children, using her husband's injury as the knife. She did not tell Mateo that night. He was too fragile, too newly awake, still crying sometimes from the grief of a loss he was reliving in real time. But she could not hide it for long, and when she finally sat on the edge of his hospital bed and told him everything, slowly, watching his damaged face try to hold it all, something happened that the doctors had not predicted and that Preston Vance had not planned for. Mateo Herrera could not remember his children, but he remembered in his bones, in the part of a man that no brain injury can reach, exactly who he was. And who he was a man who showed up. "Say that again," he said quietly, when she was done. His voice was still weak. His hands still shook. But his eyes had changed. "Somebody wants to take our kids. Mateo, you can barely walk. The lawyers, they're saying you're not—" "I don't care what they're saying." He was looking at the wall, but he was seeing something else, something far away and getting closer. "I don't remember signing that paper, Camille. I believe you that I did, but I don't remember it." He turned his head, slowly, and looked at his wife, and for a flickering moment he was entirely himself again. "So I'm going to have to become the kind of man who would sign it. Again. Every day. Until they can't argue with it anymore." The months that followed were the hardest fight of Mateo Herrera's life, and it was a fight he waged not with money, which he did not have, and not with memory, which had abandoned him, but with the only thing he had left, which was the slow, stubborn, daily act of showing up. He threw himself into recovery not for himself, but for a court date. He worked with the therapists until he could walk into a room under his own power, because he understood, with the clarity of a desperate man, that a judge would be watching how he moved. He met with the children every day, and he did not pretend to remember them, because Mateo did not lie, but he did something better than pretend. He got to know them. He sat with Jalen in silence, the way he must have once done, and slowly the boy started bringing broken radios to the hospital, and slowly the two of them started building again. And one afternoon Jalen said, not looking up from the circuit board, "You used to hum when you worked. You're doing it again." And Mateo realized he was. He learned that Aisha needed to be argued with, that she felt loved when you took her opinions seriously enough to disagree, and he started disagreeing with her about everything, gently, and she started lighting up. And little Nia, who had only ever known a sleeping father, got to meet a waking one, and she treated it as the least surprising thing in the world, climbing into his lap in the therapy room, as if she had been waiting 5 years for exactly this, and had always known it would come. She had. Her mother had promised her it would. Piece by piece, the memories did not return. But something else did. Not the past, but the present. Mateo could not remember choosing these children. So he chose them again, every single day, in real time, in front of anyone who cared to watch. And the cruel genius of Preston Vance's whole strategy, The idea that a man who couldn't remember his kids couldn't really be their father began to look, to everyone who actually witnessed it, like exactly the lie it was. Still, the law is not moved by workshop afternoons. The law is moved by evidence and testimony. And as the custody hearing approached, Vance built his case with professional cruelty. He deposed the doctors and pulled every worst-case sentence about Mateo's cognition. He found neighbors willing to repeat the town's whispers under oath, willing to say they had wondered about Camille, about the money, about whether those were really Mateo's children in any meaningful sense. He painted a picture of a broken man and an overwhelmed woman clinging to 3 children and a fortune they had no real right to, against the natural claim of blood. And Terence Bell sat at the plaintiff's table in a suit Mateo could not have afforded, and wore an expression of wounded family feeling that he had practiced in a mirror, and waited to be given his brother's children and his brother's money. The night before the hearing, Mateo could not sleep, and neither could Camille, and they sat together at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, the way they used to before any of it happened, and Mateo said the thing he had been carrying for weeks. He said he was afraid that when he stood up in that courtroom, a judge would look at him and see exactly what Vance wanted her to see: a broken man holding on to children who would be better off somewhere richer, somewhere whole. He said, quietly, that some nights he wondered if Vance was right, if he was being selfish, if a real father would step aside for the kids' sake. And Camille took his shaking hands in hers and said the truest thing anyone said in the whole story. She said, "Mateo, you signed that paper on the best day of your life and got in a car and lost 5 years for it. You woke up with nothing, no memory, no strength, and the first coherent thing you did was decide to fight for them again. That is not a broken man holding on. That is the least broken thing I have ever seen a human being do. Now you go in there tomorrow and you let them watch you do it." He went in the next morning and he let them watch. The hearing took place on a gray morning in County Family Court, in a room with bad lighting, and a tired judge named Eleanor Ruiz, who had seen 1,000 families torn apart and had learned to keep her face very still. Vance was good. He was better than good. He walked the judge through Mateo's medical records with a surgeon's precision, letting every diagnosis land. He questioned Camille until she was shaking, twisting her 5 years of impossible sacrifice into a portrait of desperation and financial motive, asking her again and again about the trust, about the money, about how convenient it all was. He put a neighbor on the stand who would not meet Camille's eyes and who mumbled the whispers into the record. By the time Vance sat down, satisfied, the room felt heavy, and Judge Ruiz was rubbing her temple, and even Camille's own lawyer looked grim. The math, the ugly, comfortable math, seemed to be winning. Then Mateo's lawyer called Mateo Herrera to the stand, and a man who 6 months earlier had been unable to say his own age walked slowly, under his own power, across a courtroom and sat down and told the truth. He did not perform. Mateo did not know how to perform. He answered Vance's questions plainly, and when Vance bore down on the memory, on the injury, on the gaps, Mateo did not flinch away from any of it. "You're right," he said, "more than once. I don't remember signing the papers. I don't remember the day I adopted them. Some of my life is just gone, and it might never come back." Vance thought he was winning. Vance leaned in for the kill and asked the question he had built his whole case around, the question he was sure would end it. "Mr. Herrera, if you cannot even remember these children, how can you possibly claim to be their father?" And Mateo Herrera, in a quiet room, in a weak voice, gave the answer that took Preston Vance's entire strategy and turned it to ash. "Because a father isn't a man who remembers," he said. "My memory failed. It happens to people. It might happen to you someday, and God forbid it does. But if it does, I hope the people who love you don't decide you stopped being theirs the day you forgot their names." He looked, then, not at Vance, but at the 3 children sitting in the back of the courtroom with a social worker, at Jaylen holding Nia's hand, at Aisha with her chin up and her eyes wet and furious. "I don't remember choosing them. So I got up out of a hospital bed that the doctors weren't sure I'd ever leave, and I learned to walk again so I could come here and choose them in front of you. I have chosen those children every single day for 6 months, awake, on purpose, knowing exactly how hard it is. Their uncle has known them their whole lives, and chose them the week he found out about the money. Ask him how many radios he's fixed. Ask him what makes Aisha feel loved. I know. I had to learn it twice, and I learned it, because that is what you do for your kids." His voice did not rise. It did not need to. "You want to know how I can claim to be their father when I can't remember them? I'll tell you. Family isn't who you're born to. It's who you refuse to leave behind. And I have refused to leave those children behind since before I can remember. Even my own brain couldn't make me quit them. What makes you think a lawyer can?" The courtroom was silent. Judge Ruiz was no longer rubbing her temple. She was looking at Mateo Herrera the way you look at something you did not expect to find in a place like this. And then Camille's lawyer stood up and quietly entered into evidence the one thing Vance had never accounted for, because Vance had built his case on the idea that the adoption was a mistake to be undone. It was a document, notarized and dated 5 years and 1 week earlier, filed with the county on the same afternoon Mateo had been in the car crash. It was the final adoption decree, and clipped to it was something the county had kept on file that no one had thought to look for. A handwritten letter, in Mateo's own hand, that the adoption attorney had asked each parent to write and place in the file, a letter to the children for the future, to be read if they ever wondered whether they were wanted. Mateo had written his on the morning before he signed, before the crash, before any of it. Judge Ruiz asked that it be read aloud, and Mateo's lawyer read it, and it was short, and it was written by a man who had no idea he was about to lose 5 years of his life, a man at the height of his certainty and his joy. To Jaylen, Aisha, and Nia, it read, "By the time you read this, you might be grown, and you might have questions, so here is the answer to all of them. I chose you. Your mother and I did not lose you when we lost Marcus and Denise. We found you. If anyone ever tells you that you are not really ours, that we took you out of pity or duty or for any reason but love, you show them this letter, and you tell them your father wrote it with a steady hand on a good day, the happiest day, the day I got to make it official that you were mine. Blood didn't make us a family. We did. Every day. And I will keep choosing you every day for the rest of my life." Dad, he had written, "I will keep choosing you every day for the rest of my life." He had written it 5 years before he woke up, and, not remembering he had ever written it, had gotten out of a deathbed to do exactly that. Judge Eleanor Ruiz took a recess. When she came back, she did not take long. She denied Terrence Bell's petition in full. She unfroze the children's trust, and in a line that made Preston Vance go very still, she ordered a review of whether the petition had been filed in the children's interest or in pursuit of that trust, referring the matter for further scrutiny. She looked at Terrence Bell, the blood uncle who had appeared at a funeral and vanished from a life, and she said one sentence from the bench that he carried out of that courtroom and that followed him after. "You are related to these children, Mr. Bell. This man is their family. The court has no difficulty telling the two apart." Terrence Bell left town in his leased car and did not come back. The insurance money, every dollar of it, stayed exactly where Marcus had meant it to go, in trust for his children, untouched by the man who had died to leave it, and untouchable by the brother who had tried to take it. And the town that had whispered found, as towns do, that it had always known Camille was a saint, that it had never really believed those ugly stories, that of course those were Mateo's children. Anyone could see it. Mateo never got most of his memories back. That is the true part, the part that does not tie up neatly, because real life rarely does. There are still 5 years of his life that are simply gone, and a whole lost final year with his best friend that he will never recover, and some nights that costs him more than he lets on. But he did not need the old memories in the end, because he built new ones, on purpose, in the light, where everyone could see. Jalen Herrera went on to study engineering, and he still calls his father when something breaks. Aisha Herrera argues, professionally now, as a lawyer, and she took the case of a foster family in her very first year and won it, and did not tell anyone why it mattered so much to her. And Nia Herrera, who only ever knew a sleeping father, and then got a waking one, grew up telling her friends the strangest and truest love story she knew, about a man who loved her so much that even a 5-year coma couldn't make him forget to come back for her. She was wrong about one detail, and Mateo never corrected her, because the wrong version was more beautiful. He had forgotten. That was the miracle of it. He forgot everything, and he chose them anyway. Years later, at Nia's high school graduation, a reporter doing a small local story about the shop teacher who woke from a coma asked Mateo Herrera the question everyone always circled back to. How does a man father children he can't even remember choosing? And Mateo, older now, gray coming into his hair, watching his youngest daughter cross a stage with her name, his name, printed in the program, gave the reporter the same answer he had given a courtroom a lifetime before. The answer that was the truest thing he knew. Family isn't who you're born to, he said. It's who you refuse to leave behind. I don't remember a lot of things. I remember that. I think that's the only thing a man really needs to remember. If you made it to the end of this one, do me a favor. Call the person who showed up for you when they didn't have to. The one who chose you. Tell them you remember. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And who's your person? I read everyone.